Okay, so the other way to look at homicides is to look at it through slightly different lens and look at the sorts of homicides that really drive public perceptions of what's going on. So obviously, mass shootings that are done in public places, especially in schools, cause a great deal of media attention and understandably public concern. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And so, in terms of mass shootings, we've made an effort in the last couple of years to start looking at this a bit more scientifically. When you do that, you get this sort of morbid debate about what counts, right? So, what counts as a public place? What counts as a mass shooting? And so, you think about a shootout over a drug deal gone bad. Does that count as a public mass shooting? And most people, that's kind of not what you had in mind when you were thinking about that, right? We tend to think about like the San Bernardino terrorist event or Columbine school shooting or things like that. So the sort of arbitrary definition that folks came up with was that it was homicides that happened in a public place and resulted in four more deaths. And if you start with that criterion, we've had 78 shootings between 1983 and when this study was done in 2013. It resulted in over 500 deaths and over 1,000 casualties. You know, one thing to keep in mind is that, 547 deaths over, we're talking 30 years, right? So um, keep in mind that every year we have about 15,000 homicides in the United States. So 15,000 homicides over a decade would be 150,000. Over 3 decades would be 450,000. All right, so 450,000 homicides and 547 are the sorts that count for this definition. So it really is a very, very, very small percent of crime, but having said that, it tends to be, pretty horribly tragic events that generate a lot of media attention. So one of the questions is, we know the U.S. has more homicides than other countries. What about these mass shootings when we try to define it in other countries? Um, it is a little bit dicey in terms of other countries not having the sort of data that we have, but these sorts of events generate a great deal of media attention, and so you can, with some accuracy, figure out how many have occurred in different countries. And by far, the U.S. seems to have more of these events than other countries, by a long shot, right? The runner-up isn't even anywhere near close to us. So, um, as with homicide, one of the questions is why is that? Why does this seem to occur in the United States? We usually, when these events happen, think about mental illness comes up a bunch, gun control comes up a bunch, but other countries have mental illness, other countries have access to weapons, maybe not at the level of the U.S., but um, that was part of the point of posting the Malcolm Gladwell article. If you haven't read it, it's a really interesting take on that these things can kind of take on a life of their own, that people get wrapped up, not necessarily a copycat, but you get these sort of ripple effects where people that wouldn't have considered it before, now it sort of enters the realm of possibility, that people that are very troubled and that have access to guns, and now the thought kind of gets planted in their head. So if you haven't read that, it's a really cool, and it's not that long of an article. It's kind of a very interesting take on these sorts of phenomena. Um, with respect to school specifically, we've had some horribly tragic school shootings. The two biggest ones that people are aware of are Columbine in Colorado and Sandy Hook. Um, and again, why does the media cover them? Because it's just horribly tragic young school-age victims. And Sandy Hook, you're talking about kindergartners and first graders, and it seems just awful beyond comprehension. And so again, as with other stuff, we sort of try to look back and say, well how common is this? Is it going up or down? And get a grip on it. And so we have sort of measures of deaths in schools that we've compiled since Columbine is when it started. Um, and if you look at the data since we've been compiling it, the homicides are this blue line, and obviously the trend, because there's such a few number of these that happen that go up and down, and most of them, aren't going to be the sorts of Columbine events that we're thinking of. Most of them are going to be, one student going after another student about a dispute or an argument. So again, they're extraordinarily tragic when they happen, but you think of, anywhere between, 14 of low and a 34 of high, in the context of tens of thousands of homicides that happen each year in the United States. Schools are a very safe place for kids. In fact, if you look at the data, right, violence in school and away from school have both been going down. So here's another great example of stats. If you look at, there's news reporting in like 2007, 2008, right? When you look at this chart, the takeaway should be violence has gone way down for kids, period. The takeaway that some people got, and again, you got to give them credit for being sort of creative, is that this is the first time in decades where kids were safer away from school than in school. And if you don't know anything about it, your assumption is that schools have gotten worse. It's safer to be away from, but the reality is that what happened is crime dropped so fast away from school that it kind of overtook the decline in the at-school crime. So these are violent victimizations. This would include fights and other assaults that happen in school and outside of school. In terms of serious violent victimization, it's never been high at all in school, and again, here's the away from school trend has been way down as well. So, again, schools are exceptionally safe places for kids, but you also have the sort of periodic horribly tragic events that we've had. All right, so aside from homicides and the second crime that really drives fear of crime and perceptions about crime is rape and sexual assault, especially amongst women. So the difference between the two: rape involves some sort of sexual intercourse, penetration, whereas sexual assault is defined anything short of that. There is a debate going on in the legal community across states and jurisdictions about, sort of what counts and what doesn't. So for example, do you have to have sort of positive or affirmative consent for it to be legal? Is it enough that she says that the person doesn't say no? Do they actually have to say yes? In some communities, they're starting to change legal standards. There's also debate on what's called initial consent. So, what happens if somebody gives initial consent for sexual activity but then withdraws it in the middle of the act? Is that the same crime as if consent had never been given? And those are issues that courts are sort of dealing with. Rape is one of the most underreported crimes, especially most serious violent crime. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of rapes and sexual assaults happen in the context of relationships and people that know each other, and folks don't want to hurt the other person. They might fear the other person. They might feel embarrassed or ashamed about the incident. They might not define the incident themselves as a rape or sexual assault. So there's a whole host of reasons why this crime is underreported. And so because of that, it's very difficult to get sort of accurate, consistent estimates of the prevalence of rape and sexual assault in society. The way that the sexual assault is defined by the victim has an impact on whether it's reported. So, rapes that involve force as opposed to more subtle coercion are more likely reported. Rapes that are done by strangers are more likely to be reported than by acquaintances. There's also issues with respect to, and this is the point up here, in that our estimate of how much happens depend upon how we define it when we interview people or when we collect police data. So if you define rape in a way that includes coercion, estimates are going to go up. If you combine rape and sexual assault, the numbers are going to go up because sexual assault happens more often than rape. So the numbers tend to be kind of all over the place in terms of estimates. And part of the reason is that people that study these issues define them differently, and they're going to get different numbers because of that. So what do we know? Well, so the starting point is to look at UCR data. So again, in context, in the United States, we have right now about 5 homicides per 100,000 people. The U.S. data right now shows that we have about 63 per 100,000 women rapes. So rape is much more common. And again, keep in mind, this is UCR data. This is crime recorded by the police. And so this is going to be a vast underestimate of how much actually happens. To get better data, we need data like the NCBS or data that was specifically collected to assess rape and sexual assault from a sample of women or Americans generally. So when we do that, we find that rape is a lot more prevalent than would be suggested by these numbers. One of the best estimates is that roughly 18% of women and 3% of men, 3% of men experience an attempted or completed rape over their lifetime. And this second number is startling and true that at a higher education institution, at a college or university, the estimates are as high as that 1 in 4 women over the course of their college career, over the course of 4 or 5 years, are going to experience an attempted or completed rape. As with most forms of violence, rape is much more likely to be perpetrated by non-strangers, so friends, acquaintances, dates, and so on and so forth. Date rape is a term that, as far as I know, came out of the 80s. And the act itself has been occurring, I suspect, as long as women and men have existed. But that definition and that sort of view and our social view of it really sort of evolved and changed quickly in the 80s. Prior to that, it was tended to be viewed as sort of not really a crime, as not that big of a deal, as an issue between boyfriend girlfriend and not the criminal justice system. That has changed fairly dramatically in the past 25, 30 years. And so, we define date rape now as rape or sexual assault that happens in the context of a dating arrangement. And for reasons I discussed earlier, it tends to be one of the more underreported forms of rape. The person doesn't define it that way. They feel embarrassed. They feel guilty. They don't want to report the other person for a variety of reasons. In the 90s, in the late 80s and early 90s, the other sort of issue, and again, prior to these sorts of designer drugs, there was alcohol and other drugs that were used to render victims helpless. But certainly, it's become a lot more sophisticated. It renders the victim unable to resist and unable to remember a lot of the events. And so there are a number of drugs that act in that way. Date rape, marital rape has only sort of recently been brought to the legal forefront and the criminal justice forefront. I pointed this out earlier, that legally British common law says that if a woman says she does, she means in the marriage contract that she is willing to grant access to her body whenever. And so by that common law definition, marital rape would have been impossible because the very act of marriage granted unlimited consent. That's changed dramatically in the past 20 years. And so rape does happen in the context of marriage. We know relatively less about it because people have only recently started to study it seriously. And so, like other things, the estimates vary widely, a low of 8% and the high of 23%. Depending upon how it was defined, whether it was rape or sexual assault, and whether we talked about attempted or completed. And so, one of the things that's pretty clear from the literature is that marital rape is much more likely to happen in the context of a violent relationship where there's battering involved, where there's domestic violence that it doesn't have to do with sexual activity. So, you tend to see it most often in relationships that are violent to start with. how to explain rape and sexual assault. One of the big issues is the motivation of the offender. Why do people engage in rape and sexual assault? What drives them? And we've kind of waxed and waned on this as a scholarly community, and some people tend to take slightly different views. But I think we've reached the point where you can say sort of it depends. That it depends on the context of a particular event. So you can think of some situations. So a date rape event that happens between young kids, where it might be more about frustration and sex, and you can think about it very clearly in terms of violence, that in the context of sort of a violent relationship where battering is occurring, that rape can be used as a form of violence and as a weapon. And so in the context of wars, a lot of the civil wars going on right now, rape is being used as a form of political and cultural dominance, that women are raped as a part of an act of war. And so really kind of how we look at it depends on the nature of the event itself. Feminists are most likely to view rape as sort of not a sexual event, but an event that involves violence and dominance. And so they tend to frame it in terms of patriarchy and sort of more deep-seated social traditions of male dominance and female exploitation. And there's research that looks at different cultures and looks at the relationship between the gender balance and how much inequality there is and levels of sexual assault and rape. And there is evidence that the more sort of general neutral, the less inequality you have, the less likely that culture experiences rape and sexual assault. Feminists also point out what they would call rape myths and how they influence male behavior. So examples of rape myths are up here, and most people have some sense of what these are. The belief that all women secretly desire to be raped, that they find it somehow sexy or desirable, that women who act seductively or dress seductively are asking to be raped, that when a woman says no, she actually means yes, and so on and so forth. And the idea is, to the extent that these are prevalent in society, they encourage sexual assault and rape. The other issue, and we just talked about this when we talked about the relationship between gender and crime, right? That masculinity and that sexual socialization can play an obvious role here. That to the extent that you train men and encourage men to be aggressive and forceful and non-empathetic and not relationship-oriented and not caring, you encourage callousness, you encourage aggression, and it makes sense that you can more likely experience rape and sexual assault in that environment. The other sort of big, and I just sort of pulled these out, obviously most theories would have something to say about rape and sexual assault. I think the two that are sort of most widely used come from feminist scholars and from social learning theorists. Social learning theorists would say that sexual aggression, like any aggression, would be learned. They would be more likely to see motivations as varied, that it could be sex, power, violence. It would really depend on that particular event. And the behavior is going to be shaped by role models, what they see in media, what they see and attitudes that they get. And so, what a feminist would call a rape myth, a social learning theorist looking at the same thing would call a form of cognitive distortion, that you sort of lie to yourself in a way that reinforces your behavior. And again, it's a sort of variation on the same thing we've been talking about, that those attitudes and values do seem to have an impact on behavior. So there is a lot of overlap here, right? So the idea that sex roles and attitudes and rapeness and all those things play a role. There is a fair amount of consensus in the literature on what things predict sexual assault and sexual violence. The other thing that social learning theorists would point out, and that it's one of the things they do in treatment of sex offenders, is that they often tend to lack the social skills necessary to express their sexuality in a normative way, to have conversations, to show empathy, to do the sorts of things that lead to a normative sex life. One one of the things that usually comes up in a discussion of rape is the role of pornography. And there's every reason to suspect that there would be a relationship, that pornography, if you look at people that do sort of analysis of what's out there, they reflect patriarchy, they reflect a lot of rape myths. There's like pseudo-rape pornography out there. And despite all the reasons to think that it should matter, there's not a lot of clear evidence to suggest that it does, that the evidence suggests that a lot of guys consume pornography, and that it's not a good predictor of what sorts of guys are going to engage in rape and sexual assault and what sort are not. Last thing, I think, is with respect to correctional intervention. There's a sort of cultural myth out there that sex offenders can't be rehabilitated, they can't be treated. And the first thing to recognize is when you say sex offender, that captures a very wide pool of folks. That you include people who are exposing themselves in public, with child molesters, with people who engage in date rape or sexual assault, and different people are going to respond to different sorts of treatment. What the literature suggests is that there's a wide variety of correctional interventions that have been used and that have been fairly successful with sex offenders. That one of the problems is that because sex offenses, some of them are very hard to detect, it's hard to get good evidence on whether treatment works. What's also clear in the literature is that people at risk for some sorts of sex offending tend to stay at risk much longer than other criminals. So they might be at risk for reoffense 10 years out, whereas most people, if they clear 2 years and they're not criminal, they're going to remain conforming. But the sorts of stuff that tends to work, chemical castration is essentially killing the sex drive through Depo-Provera or other hormone control drugs. Regular castration works pretty well as well, although there is non-zero recidivism, right? That there are some people that reoffend, which tells you that for some folks it is more about sex, that even without the equipment they engage in these crimes. The sort of state-of-the-art techniques is back to the cognitive behavior. It's the same program that works for other folks. That, if you think about the cognitive skills that would be relating to sex offending, the ability to maintain self-control, to solve problems, to manage your anger, and especially to have empathy, to think about how your actions are affecting other people and put yourselves in another person's shoes. That those sorts of skills are highly relevant to sex offending. And then the other component is that back to the elimination of cognitive distortions, that you don't allow people to engage in the sorts of thinking errors and rape myths that support their action. And when you do this stuff and do it well, there's evidence that it works sort of as well for sex offending as it does for other sorts. All right, this is a pretty good place to cut it off. I guess we're going to have part 3 coming up next.